hand to sort of it's not necessarily about the American writers or English writers or German writers. I mean, and I don't think that when thinking about world literature, the language of origin is, I mean, at some point it's irrelevant.
Okay, interesting.
I just wonder if part of the phenomenon isn't the perspective about the world. In my experience in Bulgaria, for example, or some of the Eastern European countries, they were looking out. And there was more of a pragmatic or practical reason for taking in that information, because to some extent there is this movement out of the country into a world that is using English as the lingua franca. But in the United States, there is more of a looking in, and there doesn't seem to be a need to look out in the rest of the world. And I mean, all we have to do is look at our politics today to understand that there's a lot of navel gazing here, whereas maybe in other countries they're looking out from where they're at.
Do you have any comment
on that? No, I actually wanted to sort of connect that idea to, I wanted to ask you more about the actual writers, what that lag.
And it's not you, it's someone stealing books.
I wanted you to talk more about what that lag was about. Was it really about people, was there a looking outness and it took time for there to be more dialogue inward about national politics or about the social situation? Or was it that the access to world literatures was restricted during the communist period and so there wasn't access to that? I mean, I'm speaking from a position of complete ignorance.
Of course, the access was restricted in some way, but that's not the issue. Well, I guess what I was trying to say is that the 90s were it was really a profound social turbulence taking place, and producing the Bulgarian novel of the 90s, so to say, took much longer than. Not because of the censorship of the communist times or because of the lack of access to world literature, but because of the inability of the writers themselves to sort of find their place in this new world. I guess, yeah. I know that's not a very good answer, but
That was great.
People have other questions?
And also, of course, I mean, this is very obvious, but if I have to relate what we are talking about here to what Open Letter is doing, for example, or publishers of translations are doing, of course, in the 90s there was this expectation from the world, from the other side of the Iron Curtain, that there was this expectations of that these countries will produce literature that will explain to the world what is going on with post-socialism. And some writers embraced this idea, actually, and sold themselves to the expectations of the mainly English language publishers, and others just refused to do that, and are now slowly coping with the, like actually starting to write the real stuff.
Thank you.
This is more piggybacking on the other comment about sort of an outward-gazing Eastern Europe, and an inward-looking United States. And part of the United States' inward-lookingness might be its stubborn, monoglottism, or the fact that we only want to speak English, which I think really affects the business of translation. It's almost like we want to pretend the books were originally written in English, rather than acknowledge that they were translated. And of course in Europe there's many, many languages, and I think Europe is, perfectly okay with the reality that the world speaks different languages, isn't okay with the fact that things are translated. And that's going to make the business of translation very different in each place.
Did you guys all hear that? Because I actually have a piggyback question on that. What's that? Yeah, I don't know if you could hear. It was mainly, there's not really a question necessarily, the comment that, like, because America is so monolingual and wants to only speak English and focus on English, the business of translation is much different than in Europe, where everyone accepts the idea, or most people would accept the idea that people are speaking a variety of languages because you're surrounded by a variety of languages. Is that basically?
Yeah.
So
that's just going to make the business different.
It would make the business completely different. And one of the things that crops up with, that comes up over and again, is the fact that publishers in America tend to hide and obscure the fact that the book is a translation. So there's no translator on the cover, there's no whatever. But then you have a magazine that's like purely dedicated to translation and has it on the front of new translations and has everyone listed everywhere. Did you did that obviously intentionally? Did you get any criticism for that? Did you have any what feedback did you have when you were trying to like foreground that idea?
Well, the feedback was that the magazine was short-lived.
It's not very good feedback.
If you write a novel about Nebraska in the 1920s, people generally have a sense like what that's about. I mean, it's in the national imagination what that time period was like and what the people there were struggling with. I would actually, to that issue about monoglot English speaking and provincialism, I would add to that. I mean, it's not that I'm going to disagree with that, but I would add that provincialism is universal, and that what we actually lack is an intense interest in, from publishers specifically, in contextualizing foreign work and making readers familiar with the place that the writer is coming from and the social context that inspired the literature, and the connection between those two things. The only major example I can think of in the last 10 years is the really popular one of Roberto Bolaño. Everyone knows about the political situation in Chile in the 1970s. I say everyone in quotes, everyone who reads, who would be drawn to that kind of literature now knows about this because the publishers took great pains to talk about the social context and the literary context, and yes, save me.
About that, no, it's just really interesting that publishers in America who publish translations are just willfully do not want to educate the reader about the fact that it's coming from a different context. When you're buying this thing that is informative and educational, it is like you are reading, you're educating yourself. It's not like you're buying, I don't know, a cell phone or something. And you can only go so far before it becomes breaks into the marketability, because the American culture is just seems not to be interested in another context. They're interested in the object and maybe even the reading of it, but not becoming super educated, it seems like.
I think that's an issue of approach. The only thing that would trump American xenophobia is the American love of novelty. And if you can package something as a novelty item, that might seem really trite to many publishers and many people who work in literature, but there's an extent to which I think to fight or to sort of resist the natural ignorance, and I use that not in a derogatory way, is you have to dress it up, put a bow on it, and make it really appealing on a visual and visceral level. I don't want to talk too much about that.
That's interesting, but you're going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you that you mentioned the word contextualizing, because I think this is really crucially important when introducing literatures from other countries. But at the same time, we can't take the idea of novelty as the focus of whatever you're doing, like whatever open letter is doing, because some writers may be willing to write about other things than Chile from the 70s, right? They may be writing about old things or referring to so to say, to already familiar and from boringly familiar, obvious things, so to say. I mean, many writers just refuse to be bound to and associated with the place they come from and the historical situation they write in and these kind of things. So how do you market that as a novelty? Like, if
I don't know anything about marketing books, but
I was going to ask you how you would have changed like art and made this more novel had you.
No, I think I mean not to like to make this book that's the center of the universe.
It's a good case study in a way.
I mean, I think that exactly like this kind of situation, translators tend to be enamored with the things that they are translating, and they are very knowledgeable about the place that it's coming from, and having them talk about the book and having them be the advocates for the work is I think a really good way to start that. I mean, the novelty doesn't have to be the end, the beginning and the end of it, but I think it's one way to introduce something that is so different that people don't know where it's coming from.
That sort of ties into one thing I was going to say, and then to your question is that the last time that not the last time, but one of the times that there was like a big trend in interest in translation was when during the Cold War and when the Berlin Wall was still up, everything was still under socialism. A lot of books from Eastern Europe, to use your quotes, were translated in English and were sort of popular. There's a whole Writings from the Other Europe series that Joseph Brodsky started and edited for Penguin, because it was like, that was the interest, was that you didn't know what that was. It was a novelty in the sense that we were unaware of what was actually happening behind the wall, but like
we were unaware.
Yeah, we meaning me. Okay. And that was the only way to find out. The best way to find out was through these little things that were pulled over. And so even like the Chile stuff, it's like there's sort of like a wall of Arabic fiction now. There's sort of like that's the novelty, is that's the only way that best way that you can come to understand something.
I'm struggling to frame my question. Bear with me. My impression is that a filmmaker like Kozlowski, specifically in Poland, decided to write after the Stalin era, communist era, for TV because it could be seen within the home and not be threatening in the public domain. And here you're describing, it seems to me, a very different kind of thing, where the EU and Soros and so forth have very self-consciously moved to enliven or to create something. And you said it thrived mostly to 2004, and then what happened? Did it sort of catch fire on its own, or what about this imposition? Was this in the end a good thing, or an artificial thing, or help?
Well, I think you are implying a degree of social engineering that was not there.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
or maybe in the mind of the philanthropist himself, maybe there was. But I wish we can say that these books changed the societies, or were imposing these books, produced some radical change in itself, which is, I mean, it wouldn't be true. Of course, there were other factors at play much more important than the fact that we are doing these translations. What happened is that, first of all, publishers are nowadays, they're not that vulnerable economically as they were before. Public funding, proper public